So the agenda for today is essentially what I was doing on Friday. I want to carry on the discussion. There's a little bit more that I want to say about the migrations. I've added a new element here for today, and you'll see the relationship of that, the Great Potato Famine of Ireland. I also want to give you a little bit social history of the potato, because this will give you some indication of how we might do a similar history for, let's say, cocoa, tea, sugar, cotton, any one of these other products. There are obviously dozens others of these commodities which became exceedingly important in modern history. And then I'm going to move on from there to, once I've finished with the little comments that I have on immigration and migration, and remember that the larger argument is about the movement of peoples, right? Then I'm going to move on to the question of technologies in the 19th century, and if time permits, we'll move on to the next section, which is the revolutions of 1848, very, very briefly, just to set the backdrop. But the main consideration for us in the next lecture is going to be ideologies of the 19th century, including Romanticism, liberalism, very briefly, and then, of course, communism. And that's why I want you to bring the Communist Manifesto, because we're going to look at some passages in slightly greater detail. Now, my concluding remarks to you in my previous lecture, I had been talking to you about immigration to the Americas, and you recall that I sort of had a discussion of this passage from Mary Antin's text, where she talks about the fact that when she came to the United States, what struck her most was that there was free education, and that became an occasion for me to speak to you about this idea of the middle class. The fact that the emergence of the middle class was one of the most striking aspects of 19th century history in countries such as Germany. And when I say Germany, keep in mind I'm talking about Prussia mainly, but some of the other areas of what would subsequently become Germany, because Germany was not unified in the middle part of the 19th century. German reunification takes place a little bit later. But I'm speaking here principally about, when I say the middle class, the emergence of the middle class and the notion of social goods, right? That was a point at which I terminated my discussion, the fact that for example, under a modern American taxation system, someone like me is paying from my property taxes, paying for public schools. Even if, let's say, I didn't have children, I would still be doing that, because that's the idea that there is something called a common greater social good. And I'm suggesting to you that that became really one of the principal features of the much maligned middle class. Now it's easy to malign it, because now we see that the middle class has largely become a consuming class. And that is certainly the definition of the middle class that I would give in a country such as India, because the middle class there has almost no sense of social responsibility at all towards the poor. So that's what we've been speaking about. But the context for that came out of the migrations to the Americas. And if you look over here, the sources of migration on the right-hand side of this slide, you can notice 1820 to 1860, because 1770 to 1830, it's fairly stagnant, in fact, and you can see that from the lower slide, the lower graph here, 1821 to 1830. This is by thousands. You can see that the number of people coming here is relatively very, very small to the United States in this decade. And then, of course, you can see how it really begins to mushroom. 1841, 1850, 1846-48 was the Mexican-American War, so the annexation of Texas. And you notice that in the following decade, it really increases again. I mean, it almost doubles. Right? And one of the reasons for that is that there were greater lands that were opening up in the West for settlement. Cheap farming land available, people who were pioneers and so on. So that's the reason why you see a very significant increase in the decade from 1851 to 60. And then if you see the population, you can see that it's still largely European, right? It's coming from Great Britain, from Ireland, from England, Scotland, Wales. 39 and 16, that's 55% of the population is coming from there. 31% of the population is coming, of the immigrants are coming from Germany. And then you have 1% from Scandinavia. That's going to shift again. Scandinavia will contribute a much greater number in the decades to come. But this is certainly what you see, 1820 to 60. And you'll have these graphs available. You can sort of study them. But this graph, again, simply shows what I have already mentioned, the enormous increase here. And then you're going to see the decline. So this is just before the onset of the Civil War. It also suggests that the first decade after the annexation was a period when there was a greatest thrust. That is, the availability of land was a big factor, and then again that becomes a slightly less factor as we move on into the 1860s. And here you have numbers here. You notice so you've got Denmark, Norway, Sweden over here. These countries are contributing comparatively little in comparison to Ireland, 914,000 people. Germany, 951,000. The numbers are comparable, but Germany is much larger than Ireland. So the percentage, if you're looking at percentage-wise, the Irish are contributing an enormous number, right? And we're going to have to understand the circumstances under which that happened. And before I turn to that, so this is 1841 to 60, and this one now shows you 1861 to 1890, the following 3 decades, where again you see that there is still a fairly large number of people coming from Great Britain, from England, from Scotland. You see the Irish numbers are still exceedingly high, but the big change is that in the second half of the 19th century, particularly after 1860, after 1865, you're going to begin to see the decades beginning from 1870 onwards, you're going to begin to see the number of Swedes and Norwegians, right? And most of these people are going to places such as what is Minnesota. They're going to basically the Midwest. And again, I mean, if one had to do a detailed study, I mean, it's very likely that one of the reasons that they were able to move there, apart from the fact that land was cheap and all of that, but the Midwest. I mean, I'm sure you read about what the weather was like there last week with the polar vortex and all of that. Minus 20, minus 25-degree temperatures. Well, the Swedes and the Norwegians are a little bit more accustomed to that as well, as opposed to the Asians, for example. At this point in time, of course, there is virtually no Asian migration, except you notice China, right? China, and that was the 1868 treaty that I had mentioned to you, the Burlingame Treaty, which opened up the United States to Chinese laborers, principally. All right? But at this point, you don't have any people coming from Japan or India or Korea or anything of that kind. And just to wrap up this whole segment about the U.S., immigration to the U.S., since we are moving up to the present here, so you can see, of course, that this is the most significant shift that you can think of. This is projecting the population to 2060, but even if you look at 2010, so you notice that 5% of the population of the United States is of Asian American origin now, and if you notice before 1960, it's virtually non-existent. There were Asian exclusion laws in California. In 1923, the Bhagat Singh Tin case, among other cases, the Ozawa case in 1922, basically made it impossible for Asians to migrate to the United States. So for example, with the case of Indians from 1923 to 1945, they're completely excluded, completely. And then from 1945 to 65, you have 100 Indians who are permitted per year. And then it is really the 1965 Immigration Act, which is still the backbone of the American immigration system, right? That's what opens up the country to migration from Asia, and that's where the demographic composition will slowly begin to change. And similarly, again, you can see the substantial increase of Hispanics in the United States between 1960 and 2010. Of course, the main significance of this is that if these projections hold true, and even if they're off by a few percentage marks, the United States will not be a predominantly white country by 2060, and perhaps even as early as 2050. Now, the US was not the only place that was a source of immigrants. I already mentioned to you that there is considerable immigration, obviously, into the rest of the Americas, into South America. In fact, actually more slaves were imported into Brazil, for example. So the country that I want to look at just very briefly, here you're looking at data from 1880. So that 1880 is basically the end of slavery. Okay, early 1880s is the end of slavery in Brazil. And then you begin, if you look at the data from there to 1969, you notice once again that it's predominantly European countries from the Mediterranean, largely from the Mediterranean, Portugal, Italy, Spain, and then you have Germans, but you also have an increasing number of Japanese moving into Brazil. You also have Japanese moving into Peru. The president of Peru used to be a person of Japanese origin, Fujimori. Right? So that's, and the numbers here again are if you look at the total numbers, we're talking about substantial number of immigrants coming into Brazil. And this is to signify to you that it is not only America, which is a country that has been shaped predominantly by immigration. That is certainly true of countries such as Brazil, and of course it's true of countries such as Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and some others. And if you look at this slide over here, so this is just Brazil. So the northwest here, where it says Amazonas and all of that, this is predominantly American Indian population that we're really speaking about over here. In fact, 70% of the population here is of American Indian origin. And then if you look at the portion in blue over here, this is a portion that is defined largely by its African population. The state of Bahia here over here is got only 20% white, only 20% white. And the capital of this state is Salvador, right, which is the largest city with people of African origin outside Africa. Right? That's what we're really speaking about over here. So this map really shows you the demographic composition. I'm not giving you all the details, obviously, but just a few to indicate to you what's really happening. If you look at the portion in red over here, this portion here in red, this is a portion that is got two of the main cities. There are several others as well, such as Belo Horizonte, which is not here, but Sao Paulo and Rio. And here you have a population that is divided more equally between people of European, African, and American Indian origin. And the Japanese tend to concentrate in this region as well. And if you look at this pie chart here, 2006, so this is a rough approximation of the population and its ethnic or racial composition. And you can see the white population is 49%. But again, the numbers are slowly diminishing as they have been in other countries such as the US. Not necessarily for the same reasons, but they are diminishing because immigration into Brazil is certainly nothing comparable to continuing immigration into the US, right? And here this gives you a very abbreviated, truncated chart. The reason I'm showing you this is because in some Latin American countries, there are very specific hierarchies. So if you have, if let's say 1 upon 64% of your blood is white, there's a separate term for that. If it's 1 upon 32, there's a separate term for that. If it's 1 upon 16, so forth and so on. There are separate terms for what percentage of your blood is white, which is, of course, a way of indicating how strict the racial hierarchies were in a fashion, right? And this is one of my concerns. I mean, I had pointed out to you in a previous lecture that if you look at the direction in which Brazil might go now, there's something to think about, given the results of the very recent election, because the person who has been elected is certainly someone who has indicated that he really thinks of people who are black and women and American Indians as people who are contemptible. I mean, he has indicated that on more than one occasion, very openly. Right? So I think that there's considerable reason to be concerned about that, this is not a comment on him so much as simply saying that we have to understand how these racial hierarchies have a place in a society which is comprised largely of immigrants. So there's something, of course, ironical, because one hopes that in an immigrant society that there would be a greater kind of equality. That is, that you're moving into a domain, it's a new society, you're forming it now, and that was always one of the arguments that was made about the New World, that the racial prejudices, the worn out ways of thinking of the old world would have no place in the New World. Right? But in fact, quite to the contrary, they become enshrined in the New World in various ways. Right? All right, so that is more or less the general picture that I wanted to give you of what's transpiring in the 19th century with immigration and the movement of peoples. And I'm suggested to you, I want to reiterate that before I close the section here, that I want you to think not simply in historical terms of immigration into the Americas or the peopling of Australia, for example, which I have not spoken about, or New Zealand, for example, or settler colony, or European immigrants moving into what becomes later on South Africa, the settler colonies. The idea is to suggest to you rather that we need to think in larger terms about migrations of people, including labor migrations, as one of the indubitable facts in the making of the modern world. All right? Now, you recall from the slide that I just showed you a few minutes ago, huge numbers of people coming from Ireland. Okay, the population of Ireland, early 1840s, is 8 million. 8 million. And we're going to find, if you look at just look at the chart over here once again, you can see over here, so this from 1851 to 1860. So if you look at Ireland here, you notice the number of immigrants coming in from Ireland. All right? So you can, and if you count the number of people who died in Ireland, I mean, we're talking about a country that is being depleted of its population. I mean, if you read the records of mid-19th century Ireland, there is no question that the countryside was virtually depleted of people, right? Now, what is the reason for the migration? And the principal reason, of course, is the great potato famine, as it's called. But before I move into the famine, let me take this as an opportunity to give you a little history of the potato. It's not that I have a special fondness for the potato as opposed to broccoli or cauliflower or anything else, but I think that this will give you a very good sense of how one might do the social history of a product. There's a fabulous book which I picked up about 30 years ago. It's called The History and Social Influence of the Potato by Redcliffe Salomon, published by Cambridge University Press. It's a massive book, about 600 pages, basically a social history of this crop. What is it? It's a New World crop, right? Cultivated extensively in places such as Peru and Bolivia by the Incas. How does it get to the Old World? Very easy, taken there by the Spaniards. And it becomes quite popular very quickly. In the early 19th century, the potato crop production in France between 1815 and 1840 went up by a factor of 6. And it actually helped to augment the increase in population. Now, it's also important because for those of you who remember maybe this figure from your high school or perhaps from some other class, the man called Robert Malthus. Malthus had predicted what? He had predicted that the growth in population would outstrip the food supply. I'm putting it in the simplest terms. It would outstrip the food supply. And so he had this doom and gloom outlook about the prospects of humankind, that there would be massive famine, starvation, and this would be a way for the population to drop off. And of course, actually, from his standpoint, that was perfectly fine. He is a social Darwinian before social Darwinism was invented, if I may put it this way. Now, the potato gets to be known in Russia. That's the other place where it has a long, interesting history. But it was, for many years, simply a garden crop. That is, that it wasn't really actually produced in a huge quantity through mechanized farming. That is, that people would actually have the crop, in their own little plot. It's really the famines in Russia as well in the early part of the 19th century, particularly actually in the fourth decade, so 1838, 1839, which convinced the Russians that they needed to actually increase the production of the potato considerably. Now, the potato is nutritious and it's cheap. Per acre, it actually delivers 2 to 4 times as many calories as does grain. It had a number of advantages over other foods for the consumer. And 3 of these, I think, are quite important. It doesn't spoil very easily. Its bulk, number 2, its bulk means that it easily satisfies hunger, right? And number 3, as you can probably surmise, it's very cheap. I just go to a grocery store and you can even buy a 10-pound bag of potatoes even today for, $1.50 or $2 sometimes, largely coming from places such as Idaho, but there are other places as well, right? So this crop, the potato, spread slowly across Europe, and by 1845, it occupies 1/3 of all the arable land in Ireland. Now, there's a risk there, because of course, if that crop fails for some reason, let's say that the potato becomes vulnerable, and of course, this hypothetical projection is exactly what happened, right? In Britain, by the way, it's actually fairly important in helping to fuel the Industrial Revolution as well. And Engels is going to sing, hosannas about the potato actually in some of his writing. He declares that the potato is equivalent to the iron for its potential revolutionary role, right? But what created the problem in Ireland was that you have 1/3 of the arable land, and it's going to be struck by a fungus in 1846. Now, this lack of genetic diversity from the low number of varieties of the potato, right? And there's no such thing as heirloom potatoes then. Now there's heirloom everything. You go to a farmer's market, heirloom tomatoes, heirloom this and that means, of course, you can jack up the price, 300%. But that's a different matter. That's, again, a problem of modern consumption and the way in which a modern economy works. But at this point in time, what's interesting is that it's a very low number of varieties, and this lack of genetic diversity makes the crop vulnerable to disease. And it is going to be catastrophic, particularly because you have 1/3 of the arable land turned over to the potato. So when this crop fails, there's going to be a famine. However, I want to underscore something right now, because this isn't going to be a very important argument when you're looking at the history of famines in the last 200 years, right? There is always, as in the case of the potato famine in Ireland, there is a scientific explanation. That scientific explanation is what I've given you. That is that there's not enough genetic variety, there's a fungus that strikes the crop, and there's no resistance to this, and the crop fails. All right? And then you've got too many people dependent simply on the potato. However, scholarship of the last 3-4 decades, pioneered especially by Amartya Sen. Right? So he's an Indian economist who subsequently went on to win the Nobel Prize in economics, but his early work was really all on famines. And one of the things that he argued, and I think that this argument is unimpeachable. I don't think anything in the last 3 decades or any of the historical work that's been done about famines going back in time controverts the argument that he made. And he argued very simply 2 things. One, that there are always actually social causes for such famines, right? And most often than not, famines are not as a consequence of the shortage of food. They come about as a consequence of what he calls failure in entitlements. That is, to put it in a different language, people simply don't have access to the food. They may not have access because the distribution networks, the supply, the chain supply isn't working, or they simply don't have the money. They're too poor. All right? So they don't have the entitlements. He also argued that famines do not take place in democracies. They simply do not take place in democracies. And if I think of, let's say, in the 20th century, right, so now we're thinking about famine here, and this is another illustration of where we cannot be wedded simply to the chronological framework, because in a course like this we have to think about thematic issues. We have to think about how certain tropes occur and reoccur constantly. Right? If you think of the 20th century, I mean, to my mind, for example, if I think of 3 great famines, right, which led to enormous loss of lives, the largest one undoubtedly in China, 1858, 1861, roughly during the Great Leap Forward, as it was called, when 40 million people are estimated to have died. 40 million, 40. Right? And when we get to that very briefly at that point, I will impress upon you the fact that the Chinese Communist Party knew exactly what was happening, and they did nothing about it. Absolutely nothing. And the reason they did nothing about it is because they took a kind of a Malthusian view, that this was one good way for useless people to disappear. This was one good way to arrest the population problem, right? And of course, then the second instance of that is the Soviet Union, right, during the period of Stalin. And thirdly, the Great Bengal Famine in India, 1943 to 45, which leads to the loss of 3 million lives. Now, if you look at all of these 3 instances, you would agree with me instantly, whether you agree with anything else or not. But you cannot speak of any of these 3 situations as taking place in a democracy, right? I mean, it would be impossible to describe any of these societies at that particular juncture in time. India was under colonial rule, and we know, of course, that Stalin was heading a totalitarian regime, and that China was similarly under an authoritarian regime, right, where the Communist Party held an iron grip over the population. So Amartya Sen's argument was that they do not take place. Famines do not take place in democracies, because democracies, whatever their other faults and limitations, have a system of accountability. Where is the accountability in Ireland? There is none. And in fact, even more so than the so-called scientific fact, the social causes that I want you to consider are exceedingly important. Right? So we have to begin with the consideration that the dominant economic ideology held by the English ruling elite was the philosophy of laissez faire. Go back to Adam Smith, that little extract that you had in my discussion, The Wealth of Nations, right? Laissez faire. That is, no intervention. The market will regulate itself, the invisible hand that Adam Smith talks about, that the market always regulates things best, you know. And so consequently, we find that English social policy was to do nothing, actually, at that point in time. But there were other reasons why the English did nothing besides the fact that the ruling elite adhered to the policy of laissez-faire. And those other reasons included long-standing English views about the Irish as contemptible people. I mean, you really have to read what the English say about the Irish in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. I suspect that privately some of them still hold to that view, okay? And recall that in the English Parliament, Catholics and the Irish are predominantly Catholics, the only exception being the Protestant ascendancy, as it is called. That is the English land-owning elite that was planted in Ulster. If you go back to the Nehru reading that you had, the 2 chapters, right? That's the Protestant ascendancy, it's called. But if you look at the Republic of Ireland, so you know Ireland is 32 counties, right, before the partition of Ireland in 1921. And the 26 counties of the south constitute what became the Republic of Ireland, and then the 6 counties in the north were the counties which had the predominant Protestant population that was planted there by the English elite. That's Ulster. Right? And that became the source of a deep division. And interestingly enough, although I don't have the time to venture into it right now, this is one of the main reasons for the whole Brexit problem, which continues down to the present day. Speaking about self-inflicted wounds, this being the perfect example, and the people getting a dose of their own medicine. Well, now the English, the partition of 1921 is coming to haunt them in various ways. Right? But you realize what I'm speaking about here is that the Catholics, that they had a certain view of these Catholics. And of course, the Catholics were viewed as superstitious. They were viewed as being people who only listened to the Pope, right? So they were always described as popish, right? But one of the other reasons why the English said, well, frankly, this outcome's not bad at all. I mean, you can't say it openly, but that was implicit in their policies, was because the Irish had a rebellious streak about them. And so the assumption was that, well, if you have this famine, it's wiping out a large percentage of the population, right? Well, and some of them are going to migrate. Huge numbers are going to move to the New World. So their view was good riddance. Good riddance, number one. And secondly, hey, this is a potentially rebellious group of people, and they have been completely defanged, thanks to the potato. And that, among other reasons, why the English simply, if I may put it this way, permitted the famine to continue. Right? So this was a kind of also, I'm suggesting to you, a kind of social Darwinism before this policy, before the ideas of social Darwinism really start to become prominent in the second half of the 19th century. And if you had to use a more modern language, it was certainly a form of ethnic cleansing that the English committed in Ireland. All right? So that gives you the history of the potato. We've got three things that we've done by looking at this little interlude here. One is to look at one crop, look at its history and its place in modern life and society. The second is to look at the idea of famines. And the third is to try to understand how is it that the Irish came to contribute such a large number of people to the flow of immigrants into the United States. Here are a couple of images from, these are, you can tell from the appearance, so these are sketches done at that time of people looking for, in Ireland, looking for the crop, and this is a family that's been driven by starvation. This is 1846, an image done by a man called Granger. All right. Now, I want to start looking at technologies of the 19th century. So you had two readings for last Friday. Those readings had to do with the machine gun, right? A short excerpt from a book on the social history of the machine gun, and then a short excerpt from a book by this great German historian, social historian Schivelbush, and this book is on lighting, all right? But before I look at lighting and the machine gun, I want to give you a broader consideration of what this subject is about, technologies of the state. That the 19th century is the period of the advent of these technologies in a way that we hadn't really seen before. For example, mapping existed before. Europeans are drawing maps in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s. So it's not as though cartography didn't exist before. But now cartography is going to become much more scientific in the 19th century. It's going to be used much more extensively. And we'll see the politics of cartography in a subsequent lecture, right? Countries also go to war with each other through maps. All right? For example, between India and Pakistan, contested territory, or contested territory between India and China. There are maps that both countries will put forward to suggest that this contested territory has always been part of our country. So much in the way in which countries have gone to war through pamphlets. I had spoken to you very briefly about the role of pamphlets, for example, in the American Revolution of 1776. You know, you have both the rebels and the loyalists issuing pamphlets at a furious pace. Marx and Engels were probably two of the greatest pamphleteers of the 19th century. You know, right? So similarly, countries go to war through maps. Right? There are other ways in which one fights other than on the battlefield. You also have the advent of the survey. And again, I want to take you back to my lecture of Friday because I had spent a little bit time talking about the advent of numbers, right? That we are now in the 19th century, we enter into a worldview where everything begins to be counted. It is not an accident that the word state and statistics are related to each other. Because one of the projects of the state, one of the fundamental projects of any modern state is to accumulate and disseminate statistics. Right? On the first of every month, the Employment Bureau in the US will issue figures about employment, and these will be used by both parties to make an argument about this or that. If you look at the civil services and if you look at the bureaucratic establishment of any modern state, the bulk of that portion of that establishment is dedicated to the generation of statistics. So we begin to live in the 19th century in a bounded world. Things begin to be counted, identified, categorized, described in certain ways. And in some respects, you have less freedom, because you now come under the regime of surveillance, right? And there are many instrumentalities of this form of surveying, mapping, enumeration. The census is one of the greatest ones. Right? If we look at the history of the census in any one particular country, and I want to disabuse you of the notion, because I'm certain that almost everyone has the notion. I did too, until I began to look into these things. Disabuse you of the notion that the census is simply a way of counting people who are out there. We live in a universe where the strategies that we use, the epistemologies that we deploy, do not simply count what's out there. They actually create that reality. In other words, you see, there is this kind of view, which is the dominant view, in a sense. And it's certainly something you learn in school, because that's the only way that they teach about it, that the social sciences, what they do is they try to capture the reality that's out there. And I'm suggesting to you, they don't just capture the reality, they also create the reality. How do they do so? The census is a very good illustration. Because what did the census do? In India, for example, the census was introduced in the mid-19th century. And a census was held every 10 years. In most countries, it's held every 10 years. That's the case in the United States, too. So they would go to people and they'd say, what religion are you? And if the person said, I'm a Hindu, Muslim, and Christian, they'd say, no, no, you can only have one religion. You can have only one religion. What does it mean to say that you're all three? That's meaningless. And I can tell you there are a great many people in India even today. I mean, there's a huge, massive survey done. It's called People of India. And it points to the fact that 11% of all Indians adhere to multiple religions. And particularly when you find people who have converted to Christianity. For example, the people who are working class populations, working for middle class people like myself, let's say in India. When I go back with my home there, I might have a housekeeper, I might have a driver or a maid or whatever. Well, many of these people, they've come from tribal areas or working class populations in different parts of the state, and many of them converted to Christianity. And then when you begin to talk to them, you find out, hey, they converted to Christianity, but they still worship the Hindu gods. It's like having, if I may put it this way, try to understand the spirit in which I mean it, it's like having multiple life insurance policies. You pray to one God and things don't work out. Then you say, okay, let me pray to the Christian God. Let me pray to the animist God. It's very wise as well, by the way, among other things, to hold to that view. But this has been the reality. The census, what does it do? It insists that you must project one identity. So that's what the census did. It said you have to count yourself as a Hindu or a Muslim. What is it doing? It's creating a divide now between the two. The census is not what it purports to be. It is not simply an objective description of that reality. That's what I'm saying to you. Okay? And if I had the luxury, I would give you a long, detailed study of the census, for example, in India or the United States, to demonstrate that at even greater length. But I think I've given you an instance so that you can begin to understand what I mean by that. So the state is producing all of these things: gazetteers, the census, then the archive begins to develop. That beloved thing for the historians, the archive, right? The archive develops, the idea that you begin to record and store things. And some civilizations have a greater gift or interest in it than others do. One of the reasons we know so much about the Holocaust is because the Germans, like the English, were obsessive record keepers, obsessive. What was the role of the German National Railroad? It had a huge role to play in the Holocaust. How do you think people were taken to Auschwitz, right? You had a train system. How many people were taken? Well, we have all that information because the Germans were obsessive record keepers. They're engaged upon the task of the extermination of a people, but they want to keep complete detailed records, of all of that. Right? So this is the 19th century. This is all emerging in the mid-19th century, second half of the 19th century, expansion of the civil services, expansion of the bureaucracy, expansion, of course, of the police services. Because if you're going to have a regime of surveillance, if you're going to keep people in check, you're going to have a police force. And then, of course, this will continue to grow. And in different countries, there are going to be different elements. Canine units are going to become important in the US as a way of containing civil disobedience, civil resistors, so forth and so on. However, the two technologies I want to look at are the two that people very often will not look at. They will look really at something like, let's say, the railways. So I wanted to look at the machine gun very briefly, because what the machine gun did, so that little chapter is drawn from the social history of the machine gun that I've given to you. It introduced an enormous disequilibrium of power. See, they've always been. You can look at the history of conflict, you can look at the history of colonialism and all of that. And one of the things that's very clear is that often, not always, often, you find that the victorious side has superior technology. But if you look at World War II, is I think a very good illustration. World War II is a very good illustration of where it was not superior technology on one side as opposed to the other that really determined the difference. The Germans, the English, the Americans, the Japanese all had a modern army. Now your bombers may differ. The B-52 might be an American bomber, and we know the bombing raids. But the Japanese had an extraordinary military, obviously, as did the Germans. There you're not talking about an enormous difference. But the machine guns, when it comes into play, beginning in the 1870s, for the Gatling gun first, and if you read that little chapter, one of the English colonial officials says, well, it'll be nice to subject the people to a little music from the Gatling. That's how they thought of it. Because what did these machine guns do? So you have a little mound, a little hill, you mount it on there, and then you have these Zulu warriors come at you with their spears. It was absolute massacre. Absolute massacre. I mean, you're talking about 10,000 people dying on that side, and maybe you're losing 1 or 2 people. So this idea of asymmetrical warfare is now really introduced. You don't really have that. Again, if you look at the American Civil War, you can't speak about asymmetrical warfare. The sides are fairly evenly matched, the North and the South. And of course, you could say that in the long run, it was slavery that actually made it difficult for the South to compete. Their labor force, the fact that there was dissent within, so forth and so on. There are going to be a number of arguments that you can actually evoke in order to understand why the North triumphed over the South. I mean, it's not simply a victory of good over evil. I hope you don't think that, right? There's something else there. But it wasn't technology. And what I'm saying is that in the late 19th century, particularly when we look at the conquest of America, of Africa, the machine gun is going to become exceedingly important. Right? And if you look at this chapter here, he makes a number of arguments which are quite interesting. So he's quoting here someone, a British official in the 19th century. Let me just read out this particular passage. Okay? So he says, we know that in ancient times, opulent and civilized communities could hardly defend themselves against poor and barbarous races. In our day, so he's writing in the 1880s, this person, it is the poor and barbarous tribes who are everywhere at the mercy of the wealthy and cultivated nations. This is progress, by the way, right? That instead of these poor and barbarous people killing us, now we are able to kill the hordes. And because we're able to kill the hordes, frankly, it's circular, actually. We're more civilized because we're able to kill these poor, barbarous hordes. Of course, the assumption is that because we are civilized, we have that power, right? But what he's showing you in this chapter is that there were certain kinds of racial hierarchies which were embedded. They are part of the history of the machine gun. In other words, even when you take a technology, you cannot write its history simply as a history of technology. It's a social product, right? And it has to be understood in various kinds of registers. That's the nature of the argument that he's giving. And I want to just close my discussion of the social of the machine gun by reiterating a point that I've made. But I want to add something to it, which is that there was really no response to this asymmetrical warfare that was possible except guerrilla warfare. So this is also going to be the beginning of guerrilla warfare in a concerted fashion. We cannot begin to understand how great powers, such as the United States, could not prevail in Vietnam, right? Unless we understand the fact that the enemy also understood, and that was the case again in Algeria. Why is it that the French lost control of Algeria? Because the resistance movement was organized in a fashion that simply using the technology that the French had, it couldn't do anything. Not when you have guerrilla warfare, you have cells, and these cells know nothing about each other. Right? When we get to decolonization, I will reiterate this point. But I'm saying that this is really the beginning of this in the 19th century. And the problem of asymmetrical warfare continues down to the present day. Whatever your own political views about Palestine, but when I see photographs of Israeli aircraft strafing the population, dropping bombs, and what are the Palestinians doing? They're throwing stones, right? That's asymmetrical. And this asymmetrical warfare is really introduced in the 19th century in a big fashion. Right? The machine gun is going to aggravate it. Now there's this question of lighting. Right? Just a few words on that. And then we'll end for the day. Because I want to suggest to you that there's something extraordinarily interesting in thinking about lighting. Because it helps us think about the metaphors of darkness and brightness, right? What lighting seeks to do is it seeks to eliminate the dark. And one of the ways in which we have to think about moving into modernity is how forms of colonization continue to increase. There is only one frontier that has not been conquered. Only one today, I would argue. And people are working at that too. You're not going to be able to guess at it. It's sleep. Sleep. How do we colonize sleep? There are people who are working at it. Because if you can colonize sleep, then you've really finish the project of colonization, because that's one thing you have to yourself, right? You might be, and you know that that's one of the problems with people who are tortured, that one of the principal ways in which people are tortured is what? Is to prevent them from sleeping. You thought about that, right? If you read accounts, of course there are hundreds of thousands of ways in which you can torture people, you know. I'm not going to give you a list here, okay, of the various ingenious things devised by humankind. But the colonization of sleep is a big part of that. You can read many accounts going back to Vietnam, the 19th century, Abu Ghraib, that if you want to torture people, you make sure you have lights shining upon them all the time, 24 hours a day. Right? Because otherwise, you know that a person's sleep is something when, those 5, 6, 7, 8 hours when you can blissfully, okay, check out, so to speak. So this is something I want you to think about. I'm going to talk a little bit more about lighting in my next lecture, and then we move on to the next segment.